the orders came from Beijing, that they did not want the embarrassment of the international cost of a confrontation and bloodshed and loss of life in an Olympic year. So for several days, the Chinese were fairly relaxed in their responses, and then suddenly you had the riots, the ethnic riots on March 14th, where the Chinese police seemed to have been caught flat-footed.
Professor Lopez, now the Chinese, as we ran in this piece, accused the Dalai Lama of generating this. One, I know no one really knows, but do you think there's any credibility to that? And two, what is it that Tibet really wants here?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that the Dalai Lama was behind any of this. The Chinese have a kind of tired rhetoric about the Dalai clique and him being a splittist. It's not the case that he was behind any of these events, and I think he's tried very hard, in fact, to prevent violence, and it has expressed his own dismay, his fear that these things will escalate even further. So I see no evidence whatsoever of his involvement. What the Tibetans want is another question. Of course, there are many Tibetans who would like to have their country back as an independent state. The Dalai Lama himself is not calling for that. He's calling for more autonomy for the Tibetan region, the Tibetan ethnic region, something like the special administrative region that Hong Kong and Macau enjoy. So there's a range of views both within Tibet and the exile community as to what Tibetans want. But I think all Tibetans want better jobs, better lives, freedom of religion, freedom of speech.
And Abrahm Lustgarten, from your time there, what is your sense of what Tibetans in Tibet want?
Well, I would have to agree. I think that there's a general acknowledgement, at least among many Tibetans, that they're increasingly related to and dependent in many ways on China. And there's also a widespread and growing sentiment of the potential for benefit, for better jobs, for a share of the increasing wealth that they see and modernization that's flowing into Tibet. And I think what they want, in addition to religious freedoms, which is a great concern, is a legitimate share of the economic progress that is reaching Tibet in many ways. They want jobs in the government and bureaucratic administrations, which is the great vast majority of upper-class jobs in Lhasa and in Tibet. They want a fair shake in the opportunities to open businesses, to travel freely, to farm and compete in the markets in Lhasa. They just want the same benefits, I think, that the Han Chinese are expecting for themselves in Tibet.
So, Jeffrey Bader, if that's the case, is this something, demands that China can satisfy? And what, in fact, is the attitude inside the Chinese government, as much as we can say?
Well, what the Chinese want in Tibet, above all else, is stability. They don't want Tibet to be a source of unrest that threatens China's progress and China's modernization. The argument that many of us outside of China, including the U.S. government, have been making to the Chinese is the way you get stability is by having a serious dialogue with the Dalai Lama that produces some form of meaningful and genuine autonomy. If the Dalai Lama were able to return to Tibet, the chances are that most Tibetans who revere him would accept the status of Tibet as part of China. However, the Chinese, because of 49 years of antagonism, simply don't trust the Dalai Lama. And so what we need is a process where the two sides work together to try to build step-by-step trust so that we can move towards, in my view, the return of the Dalai Lama, because I personally don't think anything short of that is ultimately going to bring the stability to Tibet that the Chinese seek.
And very briefly, Professor Lopez, do you think there's talk in the international community, should the Western governments, say, boycott the opening ceremonies of the Olympics? What's your view on how much influence the international community even has right now and how best to exercise it?
Well, I think if there's a boycott of the Olympics, the Chinese will be very embarrassed by that, and I think the Tibetans in Tibet will suffer as a result. I think if Hu Jintao would agree to meet with the Dalai Lama, some progress could be made, and if the Chinese would agree to stop the kind of demonization of the Dalai Lama, I think progress would be possible.
And your thought on that, international community, any influence here?
I completely agree with what we just said. I think a boycott frankly, would be catastrophic. It will just 1.3 billion Chinese people, if one can say anything about them, one can say that they overwhelmingly support the Olympics. And the nationalist backlash from an international boycott would be felt in U.S. relations with China, international relations with China, and by the Tibetan people. So that is not the point of leverage.
And I'm sorry that we have to end it there, but thank you.